go into this conversation here with Don Lemon and Breaking Point. So if you want to laugh, now's a good time to get ready to get your laugh on. Okay. Go ahead and smash that like button if you haven't had a chance to do so. And we're going to go ahead and dive into this story here. So believe it or not, Don Lemon actually did have an appearance on Breaking Points with Ryan Grimm. And I forget her name. I'm sorry. Emily. Yes. With Ryan Grimm and Emily. There are two parts during this conversation that I do want to touch on. The first part we're going to talk about is whether or not CNN actually covered the Bernie Sanders campaign properly. And I think what you're going to define from this conversation is that Don Lemon, he may have left CNN, but the CNN is still in Don Lemon. Let's go ahead and get started here with Don Lemon on Breaking Points.
So one of the criticisms I had of CNN over the years is around its coverage of the kind of left wing of the Democratic Party, and in particular, missing the kind of the energy behind the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign, and then missing it again the second time around. Like 2020, Bernie Sanders almost seized the nomination. And it seemed to catch the media flat-footed both times. I'm curious what your editorial meetings were like throughout 2016 and 2020, or was there just so much Trump that there just wasn't kind of the oxygen for the Democratic primaries?
In other words, Ryan is asking Don Lemon, why is it that CNN decided to suppress Bernie Sanders campaigns both times?
Well, I want to make sure I understand what you're saying, Brian. What are you asking me, that you think that Bernie Sanders wasn't given his due in traditional media? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And let me tell you a little story about that real quick. Like, so in February of 2020, you remember Rebecca Cutler, the old head of CNN talent? Mm-hmm. She reached out to, or somehow we got connected. I went back, still at The Intercept, but I was at The Intercept at the time. And she said, look, we have really missed the boat on covering the left wing of the Democratic Party. Like, we need people who have covered that before and who understand this rising progressive energy. And so CNN brought me in and said, look, we need to get you on some of these programs because we need somebody, who can speak to this obviously now rising energy within the Democratic Party. And then that happened a couple times. And then Bernie lost the South Carolina primary and got wiped out on Super Tuesday. And they said, actually, never mind, we're good. Like, we don't need to worry about this kind of progressive wing. Maybe in 4 years if it bubbles back up. But there was a fear inside CNN, reflected through Rebecca's outreach, that they had missed something fundamental about the country that was represented by the rise of Bernie Sanders.
I don't know what conversation you had with Rebecca, who I know, and so I won't get into that. But I think if there was any outreach for you to cover something that was happening in the news or the zeitgeist politically, I think that Rebecca should be commended for recognizing that. The second part is that I've never heard anybody say that CNN should be more left. So, hey, there's a first time for everything. I didn't necessarily think CNN was left. I thought that CNN was about facts. I think CNN has the best journalists in the world.
So this is Don Lemon's moment here to defend and kiss up to the network that fired him. And some of you may be wondering, why would he do that? It's quite simple. You don't want to burn bridges, they say. Also, there's the possibility that he could also end up back at CNN at some point. You never know, talking about years down the line. But also, Don Lemon still wants to maintain access to people that he still knows that works at CNN, and also some of the networks that he's created along the way, networking with different people. So it's kind of like he's not going to burn his bridges, because he knows that now that he's independent media, he still wants to be able to get some of those people from CNN to come onto his independent show. Same thing with Mehdi Hasan when he had the interview with Crystal and Kyle. He didn't want to throw MSNBC completely under the bus, because he still wants to maintain access to certain people and certain things. So here goes Don Lemon trying to basically defend CNN at all costs. The reality is we all know that not just CNN, but all of mainstream media, yes, they did try to suppress Bernie Sanders' campaign as much as possible. And while I have my criticisms about Bernie Sanders today, and I absolutely regret donating all the money that I did to Bernie Sanders, if I could do it all over again, I would have given that money to mutual aid. I would have given that money to people who put it directly in their hand, not to Bernie Sanders, not to a presidential campaign. That being said, you cannot deny the movement that was created around the Bernie campaigns at that point in time. And so for CNN to pretend like this was not happening, yes, they were actively suppressing the campaign, but Don Lemon isn't going to admit that.
But I also think you asked me what my editorial meetings were like. I mean, no one was trying to push Bernie Sanders, and at least in my editorial meetings, and I would venture to speak for the network now. Well, I'll speak for myself. I don't think that anyone was trying to push Bernie Sanders out. I think that Bernie Sanders may have had sort of outsized influence with a certain segment of the Democratic Party, but all polls in 2016 pointed to Hillary Clinton.
Pause. So basically what Don Lemon is telling you is that they're going to put their attention on the candidates that are polling the highest, right? All right. So let me go ahead and tell you why he's lying. If we want to look at, let's go to the 2020 Bernie 2020 campaign. There were multiple times during the Democratic primary campaign in 2020 where Bernie Sanders was polling number one. CNN in the beginning, they did discuss him. They discussed him in a negative way. And then they saw that didn't work. So then they decided to basically just ignore the campaign altogether to see if that would work. Then Bernie Sanders had a heart attack and then he started polling well again. So there was always the attempt to suppress and to try to bury the campaign as much as possible. The other point that he made there, and he said, well, he represented a certain left segment of the Democratic Party. So Don Lemon feels since that segment of the Democratic Party wasn't large enough, there shouldn't have been much focus there. However, here's the part that Don Lemon is omitting, and that is the fact that there were a number of registered independents that also supported Bernie Sanders' campaign. There were people that voted for Donald Trump that supported Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016. So he's pretending like the only people who were supporting Bernie Sanders were people who were Democrats, and that is honestly not the case. For those of us who were on the ground, we know better.
Polls in 2020 and public sentiment pointed to Joe Biden. And so what was shocking, I think, to myself was the reaction from Democrats to the nomination of Hillary Clinton instead of Bernie Sanders. In 16, especially in 2020, I couldn't get to gauge it because I didn't get to go to the conventions. I think that was around, because of COVID. But here's the shocking thing. So networks have editorial calls or meetings with campaigns, right, to figure out how you're going to cover the campaigns. In my experience, having those editorial calls and meetings with the Trump folks, they knew every single thing that was happening in the meeting. Every single thing that Don Lemon had ever said about Donald Trump, his folks knew about it. They knew where to place him. They knew who they wanted him to talk to. They knew who they wanted him to call into or do in-person interviews. By contrast, the Clinton campaign was so above it that, they had no idea what I was saying about Hillary Clinton or whatever they were, she did not have as much media outreach. She got to pick and choose where she went, and rather than just doing what Donald Trump did. So listen, I think that the Hillary, but yet and still the public wanted Hillary Clinton. They didn't want Bernie Sanders. So I say that to say when after all of, Republicans did not love Donald Trump. They held their nose and they voted for him.
Let's just pause here for a second. When he says that people didn't want Bernie Sanders, they wanted Hillary Clinton. Didn't Bernie Sanders win every county in West Virginia, and the DNC decided to give those delegates to Hillary Clinton anyway? Isn't that one of the reasons why there was a DNC fraud lawsuit? I actually interviewed the lawyers for that lawsuit on the show last year. So, he's going to forget that there's super delegates. and how the superdelegates, yes, they did cheat Bernie Sanders in 2016. That was messed up. So he's just going to pretend like that didn't happen. You can leave CNN, but the CNN don't leave you.
The never Trumpers, all of the people, from Ted Cruz on down. When he became the nominee, everyone got behind him. When we were at the convention, it was Trump, 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 Trump. It wasn't Jeb. It wasn't, Cruz. It wasn't Rubio. It wasn't any of those people. By the time we got to the Democratic convention and Hillary Clinton was a nominee, people were yelling, Bernie, Bernie. And we were like, what the hell is going on? So I think that Bernie Sanders, that wing of the Democratic Party actually did as much, if not more damage to Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump.
So here's Don Lemon repeating mainstream media talking points and blaming the voters. Those of you that supported Bernie Sanders, you actually did more damage to Hillary Clinton. Okay. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. Does everybody forget this? Has Don forgotten this? Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. The majority of Americans voted for Hillary Clinton. The only person who damaged Hillary Clinton's campaign was Hillary. She's the one that chose not to campaign in the Rust Belt. She's the one that called Trump supporters deplorables. What? I don't know. Maybe it's just the fact that she ignored a certain segment of the population that she felt wasn't educated enough or important enough to understand her campaign. Maybe that has something to do with it. But he's blaming the voters, folks.
So look,
but I think that's an interesting question to be asking, to say what.
I think Bernie Sanders is a fantastic politician. Yeah. But I do think that there is a lesson in it for Democrats that you have to get behind the person who is the actual nominee, and you cannot have sour grapes over the person who did not become the nominee.
You have to get behind the person who's the nominee. Again, first of all, you don't have to do anything. 2, he's just going to forget the fact of the DNC fraud lawsuit. Forgetting superdelegates. 3, this is Don Lemon letting you know that he's totally fine with the DNC picking the candidate. And then 4, he's ignoring the fact that some of the people that supported Bernie Sanders in the Dem primary were not Democrats. Bernie Sanders actually did really well among independents, not just in 2016, but also in 2020. Woo!
That's how the process worked. So I know that people are upset, and they're upset about the progressive wing, and they don't think it gets covered enough. But this is where we are. The nominee or the person is Joe Biden. The nominee or the person then was Hillary Clinton. I think the Bernie Sanders progressive wing of the party should have gotten behind them. And that's the reason, one of the reasons, the main reasons that we're in the predicament that we are now and that we had a Trump presidency.
No, there were a number of people that supported Bernie Sanders in 2016 that did turn around and support Hillary Clinton in the general election. You don't know what you're talking about, Don. Don Lemon is not on the street with the people. This is a big part of the problem. You're not on the ground with the people. You guys go to a fancy studio and you read a teleprompter. So there's that. And by on the ground, I don't mean you went to the convention. I'm talking about talking to the people on the ground who were supporting those candidates at that point in time. So there's that. Like, I don't even know what to say here. All those years on mainstream media, and even after getting fired from mainstream media, and you got fired from the network whose ratings are in the toilet and they can continue to tank, by the way, and you have learned nothing from any of this.
But I guess the point would be, if CNN anchors are at the 2016 convention saying, what the hell is going on? That's kind of reflective of the point that I was making, that you guys should have seen this coming and should have known what was going on, where was this anger coming from?
Just because we're realistic about who the nominee is, doesn't mean that we didn't see it coming. Bernie Sanders was not going to win. Bernie Sanders was not going to be the nominee. So I turned to my producer and said that I'm not saying this on the air, but maybe I did say it on the air. I was surprised because Republicans fall in line. Democrats fight each other. Democrats usually wet the bed. I'm sorry. Bernie Sanders was not the nominee, nor was he ever going to become the nominee.
So you see this? And I told you before, people like Don Lemon, the reason why they were even on CNN is because they maintained the status quo. That's why. You hear this? So because someone was not going to, you didn't think they were going to win. And I argue against that, actually. I look back at 2016 and I honestly think Bernie Sanders could have beaten Donald Trump. I honestly think so. So the question that should be asked here, and I feel like Ryan did not push back enough. The question that should be asked here is, well, Don, do you think it's okay that the DNC can actually choose the nominee? Do you think that's okay, Don? Don, do you think it's okay that there was a DNC fraud lawsuit because they cheated Bernie Sanders in 2016? Why is Ryan Grimm not asking those questions? Is he afraid that Don Lemon won't come back onto Breaking Points again if he does? Even if he does, so what?
And I know that people are upset by it, but that's the truth. It's the same thing for Republicans. Nikki Haley is not the nominee. She's not going to become the nominee. Donald Trump is a nominee, regardless if you like it or not. The guy's in court. And guess what? Republicans are going to fall in line.
Nikki Haley was not a good example because when we looked at the primary, the Republican primary, the majority of people voting for Nikki Haley were not registered Republican voters. So that is a bad example.
And if Donald becomes the president again, it'll be because Republicans fell in line.
One of the things I think is cool about, like, Ryan and I have both been critical of you. You've probably been critical of independent media. This is the first time we've ever talked in the past. But one thing that I considered a low point, honestly, in media coverage of Donald Trump was the segment with you and Rick Wilson talking about credulous boomer rubes. And I wonder, honestly, if there's an argument that sort of seeing other Americans through that lens, and maybe now in independent media, it's easier not to, but seeing other people through that lens of, credulous boomer rubes, laughing at
Rick Wilson about that was not my assessment of that. I was laughing at the Ukraine on a map thing. That was my point. I did not make any comments about Americans. So you'll have to talk to Rick Wilson about that.
But I guess there's an interesting mirror going on where the Trump supporters see that clip and they
Trump
feel
used it in the map.
Yeah, and they feel like they're not being represented. Bernie people feel like they're not being represented on CNN. And to the point about the polling that you mentioned, just one point on Joe Biden's polling. Joe Biden was not polling ahead. You had said that Joe Biden was polling ahead. Joe Biden was in the toilet the entire time. He finished 4th in Iowa, 5th in New Hampshire, got annihilated in Nevada.
We got to the convention.
Yeah, and then he won after $175 million in free media between Nevada and South Carolina, and then he wins Super Tuesday and he won the nomination, no doubt about it. But he wasn't polling ahead before that.
Let me chime in here. The point there, and I think Ryan could have made this a little bit stronger. The point that he's making there is that the entire time that Bernie Sanders was polling number one and he was winning those primary states in 2020, CNN was not covering Bernie Sanders in a favorable way. They actually covered it in reference to him being, oh, this is scary. This could be terrible. This is not working out the way that we wanted it to. I mean, come on, guys. Like, we all saw this in real time. So the point that Don Lemon made when he said that, well, the person who was going to win, the person who was polling high, that's the person who we're going to cover. Before South Carolina, Joe Biden lost every primary state. And Bernie Sanders was winning those states. And when CNN did cover Bernie Sanders, they covered him in a negative way. And they never gave him as much coverage as they did after Joe Biden won South Carolina. That is the point that Ryan is trying to make there to Don Lemon. Now, we're going to move on to another segment of this interview here. social media's effect on cable news. Did I want to go to that one? I wanted to go to, is CNN biased? This part right about here. We'll see.
It's part of this kind of left wing of observers who was saying mainstream media needs to drop this like fake objectivity, this view from nowhere, this view from God, and acknowledge that they have biases and speak from that perspective and earn trust that way. That was a very commonly held view, for many years on the left. And then CNN and put aside MSNBC, CNN really did that during the Trump administration. And I remember agreeing with a lot of what CNN was saying, disagreeing with a decent amount of it, particularly the endless focus on Russia. But I also remember thinking, whoa, that's a little bit much. You guys are starting to sound like kind of a Democratic mouthpiece. And I also recognize like they're doing kind of what I asked them to do for years, but now that they're doing it, not so sure I like it. And I'm curious what it was like for you to be involved in that.
You're biased, Ryan.
Well, I am. I am.
So, yeah. Listen, I don't like that. I don't believe in that I don't believe in the premise of listen, I'm not trying to be confrontational. I don't agree with the premise of what you're saying and when people put it in that context. Because listen, we all view life through a certain lens, whether we're journalists or not, whether you're a woman, a man, black, white, Jewish, Palestinian, whatever. We all view the world through our own lenses. And it is okay to be a journalist and to have a point of view. That's okay. It is actually okay to be a journalist and have an opinion. There's opinion journalism.
Pause. Let's chime in here for a second. Yes, we do view the world in our own view, but all of us don't have shareholders invested in our network that want us to present a particular narrative that follows the State Department. Because if you look at BlackRock, if you look at Vanguard Group, if you look at State Street Corporation, these are companies that are shareholders in a lot of these media networks. And you don't become a shareholder of media without getting something in return or something out of it for you or some type of narrative that you want pushed. This is no secret. Don Lemon knows that there's a certain narrative that they can share. He knows there are certain things that they can discuss and certain things they can't. At the very beginning of this interview, he admitted that himself. There were stories that he wanted to cover, and they told him he couldn't cover it because they said these weren't big enough stories, right? And he said he had a little bit more editorial freedom than other shows on CNN because his was the evening show at that point in time. So we can't sit here and pretend like there isn't money and corruption that is involved and deeply embedded in mainstream media. And that is why they have the talking points that they have. Now, you'll even catch this with some independent media nowadays, too. Not necessarily because they're shareholders, but because they want access to certain people. And the reality is, most of the people that are to the left of the so-called progressives in the House, to the left of the squad, to the left of Bernie Sanders, most of us are not given that access. Okay? So let's just keep it real. Because if this show with Ryan and Emily were to the left of Bernie Sanders and they said the things that I say on this show, Don Lemon wouldn't even be on that show. They like to protect the status quo.
So I don't believe in that BS about, journalists just have to sit there and go, what do you think? What do you think? Okay, fine. That's not how it works. I think that, I said you were engaged. I think that when that was the zenith, I believe, of CNN during that time. And it may have looked, I think, that we had moved to the left or that, we were somehow becoming an arm of the Democratic Party. That was only because of the Republican side and mostly Donald Trump and the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. The facts were not on their side. So by the simple fact of pointing out that someone is lying, that you're getting misinformation, it may make people think that, oh my God, you must be on the Democrat side. No, you're on the side of truth.
No. If you were on the side of truth, then I'm sure you would have covered Joe Biden in the same respect that you covered Donald Trump, especially when we talk about allegations and accusations, John, against the two of them. Let's cut the BS. CNN, yes, obviously was an arm of the Democratic Party, just like Fox News is an arm of the Republican Party. Who does Don think he's trying to fool in this interview? So here he is explaining to Emily and Ryan that, well, the truth and the facts just happen to be on the side of the Democratic Party. Really? Really? Isn't Joe Biden out there calling the protesters anti-Semitic right now? Hasn't the Democratic Party, the Biden administration, been caught lying about Israel? Haven't all these people, they're all liars. They're all liars. Just admit it. We all know how this works. CNN supports the Democratic Party in their narrative. Fox News supports the Republican Party in their narrative. There's no shame in admitting that. That was the network that you worked for. You were a part of it. You had no problem when you were getting paid by CNN. The CNN, these guys were making a lot of money. Don Lemon is like $1 million. This guy's a millionaire. Okay. So the reality is he doesn't want to tell the truth about CNN because Don Lemon, even though he's still not working there, he still wants to be able to maintain those professional circles that he established because he was a part of CNN. I know how this works. And he still wants to maintain access to some of the people. This is a hot mess.
I know we have to wrap, but the Russia coverage was not great.
The Russia coverage was not great from who? From anyone. The Russia coverage wasn't great from anybody.
CNN, from corporate media. Yeah, I mean, just the question about Donald Trump didn't have facts on his side.
I actually think that the Russia coverage on CNN was good. I think the Russia coverage in the media was good. I don't think that it was bad. You may disagree with it. That's your bias. But I actually think the coverage was good. And I think that people are smart enough to discern what's true and what's not, what's real and what's not. And
you guys pushed Russiagate. You guys actually believed in Russiagate. Like, it's just the lies and the lies.
So I don't think that the coverage was that bad. I don't fall into that category. And I think people I think people sort of romanticize the time that we were in. Like, people romanticize, COVID and the protocols that were in place, and this was bad and that was bad. They don't remember the time that we were in. And so, I think that the media did the best job that they could at the time. I don't think that it was terrible. We can always look back, from being armchair quarterback, Monday morning quarterback, and saying, oh, you should have done this, shoulda, woulda, coulda. We didn't. And again, my advice, accept things the way that they are, learn your lesson, and move on.
Yeah.
Now, this is something I feel like Ryan and Emily also could have pushed back on. Thank you so much for that, Lance. CNN having the IDF overlook their Gaza coverage was the nail in the coffin for CNN. Exactly. Ryan and Emily didn't push back on it. Very interesting. You have recent examples that you can mention to push back there. But again, they're not going to be too harsh on Don Lemon because they still want Don Lemon to come back on the show. Let's give it up, folks. It is what it is. It is what it is. But for him to say that CNN did great coverage considering the time that they were in, nah, man. No, because it's not even just about during the pandemic. You were lying before the pandemic too, bro. You've been lying for years. And then you would get people taking their time and covering things in such a way during that time and actually doing an excellent job on that. All you had to do was turn to investigative journalism. All you had to do was turn to independent media who were actually debunking your lies, Don. All you had to do was turn to people like the Gray Zone, Electric Intifada, right? All you had to do was to turn to people who were actually doing real investigative journalism. You could have looked at Seymour Hersh, people who were actually on the ground, people who covered both sides of the perspective and included important information that your network left out, Don. So I understand you got to continue to kiss their ass so that you can still get access. But at the end of the day, don't try to sit up there and say that you guys did phenomenal coverage because you did not. It's such a mess. It's such a mess. And Ryan Grimm knows better. Ryan knows better. For him, like sitting there, remember, he's the DC bureau chief for The Intercept. So he still want to maintain his access to politicians in DC. Access. That's what it's all about. What a joke. What a joke. If you are going to bring people on, if you're going to bring on Mehdi Hassan, and if you are going to interview Don Lemon and you don't push back, especially he interrupted you a couple times throughout this interview, you don't push back on the bullshit, I'm looking at you with a side eye.